The Intergalactic Academy had always chosen landscapes that seemed designed not for education, but for humiliation, and the Sulcan Rift was no exception. Sarah Lane stood at the edge of the chasm, her boots sinking slightly into the ochre dust that coated the plateau, and tried to steady her breathing. Before her stretched a wound in the planet's surface, a mile of darkness yawning between sheer cliffs. The rift's winds rose from far below, carrying a dry heat in one moment and a biting chill in the next. Unpredictable currents that warped the air into wavering columns of distortion. Even from the surface, she could hear the deep groans of rock shifting somewhere in the abyss, like a living creature warning intruders away. An instructor's voice rolled through the comm units attached to every cadet's collar. The tone was always the same, calm, commanding, almost bored, as if the task about to be given was a routine nothing more complicated than a written exam. Cadets, your directive is to cross the Sulcan Rift within the cycle. Each team is responsible for the design and execution of its own method. You may use materials provided or resources gathered locally. Survival and efficiency will be graded. Creativity will be noted. Failure to cross means failure of the course. The announcement ended, and silence swept over the group, broken only by the rustle of equipment and the low hum of alien devices activating. Sarah's classmates represented 20 different species, each with its own culture of technology and tradition of superiority. To her right, the Velkari twins, angular beings whose crystalline bodies refracted the pale light into flashes of violet and gold, extended filaments of hardened silica that grew from their limbs like scaffolding. With practiced elegance, they began assembling a bridge of crystal strands that hummed as it stretched outward, a lattice of brilliance spanning into the empty air. Behind them, the Kethmaran cadets, broad-shouldered reptilian warriors with 4 arms, unfolded a magnetic framework from a container, each panel locking into place with metallic clicks. Sparks danced between the plates as they aligned the structure, testing the stability with roars of approval. Others activated even stranger solutions. A group of Zalari, translucent beings filled with liquid that pulsed in rhythm with their speech, unpacked a series of energy coils that crackled as they expanded, ready to be shaped into a temporary rail of pure force. A hegemon student, tall and serpentine, coiled around a support beam while his companions deployed drones that hovered in formation, projecting a thin walkway of light that flickered like a mirage. Every cadet seemed busy with humming, buzzing, flashing technology that promised triumph. Sarah carried none of these marvels. Her issued pack was lighter than the others, containing little more than rations, a survival knife, and a coil of rope that seemed laughably inadequate when placed beside bridges made of crystal and plasma. She knew the instructors had offered every cadet the same base kit, but most had brought additional equipment from their own worlds. She had only what she could carry, and she had chosen not to weigh herself down with devices she barely understood. The rope lay coiled across her shoulder, its coarse fibers pressed against her uniform, and she could feel the skeptical stares of nearby cadets who glanced at it and then quickly looked away with smirks curling on their strange mouths. She crouched near the cliff and studied the rift. The edges were jagged, chipped away by centuries of wind erosion, and scattered boulders lay within reach. The opposite side looked impossibly distant, yet she measured it carefully with her eyes, tracing possible anchor points where the rock jutted outward. Her grandfather had once taken her camping in the Colorado mountains, long before she ever dreamed of leaving Earth, and he had taught her that a canyon's shape was never random. Every indentation, every outcrop, every line of weathered stone could be a handhold or a brace. She remembered his rough hands showing her how to knot ropes around tree trunks, how to test for hidden cracks, how to listen for the sound of shifting ground. Those lessons returned to her now, not as nostalgia, but as calculation. The wind picked up, and the Velkari lattice shivered, emitting a sharp ringing tone. One of the crystalline cadets clicked with irritation and reinforced the structure with thicker strands. He turned his head towards Sarah, and his faceted eyes glimmered with disdain. "Primitive human," he said in a voice like glass chimes. "That cord you cling to will not carry even your weight, much less build a path across this rift." His sister added, "Our kind has spanned rifts wider than this since before your species walked upright. Stand aside and observe how true engineers work. Their words cut through the air with a confidence sharpened by centuries of superiority." Sarah said nothing. She touched the rope with her fingers, feeling the roughness of the fibers, and reminded herself that silence was sometimes the most effective answer. Her task was not to argue. Her task was to cross. As she scanned the horizon, she noticed dust devils spiraling up from the chasm, sudden whirlwinds that dispersed as quickly as they formed. The magnetic panels of the Kethmaran team rattled under the gusts, and one cadet cursed as a piece slipped from his grasp and tumbled into the abyss, its glowing outline vanishing in seconds. Sarah's eyes followed the fall, noting how the object had been pulled sideways before disappearing into darkness. That meant the winds were not simply vertical. Unpredictable cross-currents twisted through the rift, strong enough to snap rigid beams or fling drones off course. A bridge that tried to fight the air would shatter. Only something flexible, something that bent with the storm, could survive. The instructor's voice returned over the comm, announcing that the timer had begun. "You have 24 hours. Begin." Sarah exhaled slowly and pulled the rope from her shoulder. The coarse length uncoiled like a living snake, dropping into the dust with a soft thud. Around her, cadets activated drones, adjusted visors, and barked instructions in their native tongues. She heard the humming of force fields, the grinding of crystalline growth, the metallic clang of panels locking together. Every sound echoed against the cliff walls, creating a cacophony of determination. She walked away from the crowd, toward a cluster of weathered boulders near the cliff edge. Some cadets spared her a glance and then dismissed her with laughter. One Kethmaran warrior muttered something in his guttural dialect and slapped his companion's shoulder, both breaking into loud hisses that passed for laughter. Sarah ignored them, crouched by the rocks, and ran her hand across their surfaces. She tested each for stability, pressing her weight against them, listening for the hollow echo of fractures. One stone answered with a solid, immovable tone anchored deep into the earth. She smiled faintly. It would make a perfect anchor. With careful motions, she began tying knots, looping the rope in patterns her grandfather had drilled into her until her fingers had learned the rhythm by heart. The rope hissed softly as it tightened, each twist locking into place with a strength that seemed invisible but absolute. As she worked, she felt the wind shift again, brushing strands of her hair across her face. She raised her head and looked at the rift, imagining the bridge not as a rigid path, but as a living extension of the land, swaying and breathing with the storm. Around her, the alien cadets continued their grand displays, but she no longer cared. The assignment was clear. The rift would be crossed, not with crystal, not with plasma, not with magnetic plates. She would cross it with rope, knots, and the oldest lessons she had ever learned. And so the chapter closed not with triumph, but with quiet determination, as Sarah pulled the rope tight, secured the first anchor, and prepared to challenge a chasm that had already defeated machines. Sarah had secured the first anchor and worked in silence when the atmosphere of the plateau shifted. What had begun as confident determination among the cadets slowly thickened into rivalry. Each team wanted not only to cross the rift, but to prove superiority, and every glance turned into a measurement of worth. The Velkari twins stood nearest, their crystal lattice stretching farther into the void with each moment. Light fractured through the translucent strands, scattering brilliant patterns across the dust. The spectacle drew admiration from a group of Zalari, whose glowing bodies pulsed in rhythmic approval. Sarah felt the contrast between their dazzling construction and her plain rope gnawing at the edges of her concentration, but she pressed her knee into the ground and tugged at her knots until they creaked with resistance. One of the Velkari twins turned, his body shimmering like a glass tower beneath the harsh sunlight. His eyes glinted with refracted fire as he called out in his sharp, chiming tone. "Human, is this the great innovation your kind has brought to the Academy? String and stone? Perhaps you will weave a nest and invite the rift to cradle you." Laughter erupted from his sister, a high, ringing cascade that bounced between the cliff walls. Sarah forced herself not to look up. She wound another knot, tightened it, and shifted her weight to check the rope's tension. The Kethmaran cadets had gathered a short distance away. 4 thick arms moved in coordinated rhythm as one warrior hammered a magnetic plate into place, while another adjusted a stabilizing coil. Their voices rose in guttural chants of pride. When one of them noticed Sarah crouched over her rope, he barked something to his companions. All 3 turned their reptilian heads toward her, jaws opening wide to release hissing laughter. The sound was mocking, loud enough to draw the attention of other groups. Soon, chuckles and murmurs rippled across the plateau. Sarah's rope was no longer her private project. It had become a spectacle, a target of derision. She stood slowly and dusted her hands on her uniform, ignoring the heat in her cheeks. The Velkari sister approached, her body refracting light so sharply it hurt Sarah's eyes. She pointed at the rope with a crystalline finger that tapered into a spear-like tip. "Even if your knots hold, the wind will cut your line to ribbons. You humans cling to primitive tools because you lack imagination." Her brother chimed in. "And yet she persists, as if determination can replace brilliance." Sarah met his gaze for the first time, steady and unflinching. She said nothing, but the silence seemed to strike harder than any retort. The crystalline cadet narrowed his eyes, unsettled by the refusal to engage. While ridicule spread, one figure watched without joining. A Zalari cadet, his translucent body glowing faintly blue, stood with his hands folded. He tilted his head as if studying Sarah's movements, not to mock, but to observe. She noticed his gaze briefly and returned her attention to her work. For a moment she wondered if curiosity might eventually pierce the veil of scorn, but the thought vanished as the wind picked up again, rattling the alien structures. The mocking intensified when Sarah uncoiled more rope and began testing its length by stretching it across the dust. One Kethmaran warrior clapped his hands together in exaggerated applause and shouted, "Perhaps she will hang herself across the rift and let us walk upon her body." The others roared with laughter. Even the instructor's neutral presence, watching from a distant hover platform, did not silence the chorus of derision. Sarah felt the sting of humiliation clawing at her resolve. Every instinct urged her to snap back, to throw words as weapons, to demand respect. Yet she remembered her grandfather's advice whispered at a fire long ago. "You cannot silence a storm with shouting. You can only outlast it." She gripped the rope harder, let the laughter roll over her, and anchored the second line. Her decision to remain quiet only fed the frenzy. The Velkari sister circled around her like a predator, crystal shards clicking against each other as she moved. "Look at the human, so stubborn she refuses to admit defeat. She ties her fate to fibers while true cadets shape worlds." Sarah ignored her again, looping the rope through a carved groove in the rock and pulling it tight with all the strength in her arms. The fibers strained, but did not snap. The sound of resistance was sharp and reassuring, a reminder that weakness existed only where she chose to believe in it. As dusk approached, the sun's red glow painted the rift in blood-colored light. Shadows lengthened, and the alien structures glimmered with unstable energy. The Velkari lattice groaned under the sudden temperature drop, producing a chorus of sharp cracks. The crystalline cadets adjusted their construction, their faces tense for the first time. The Kethmaran warriors added extra coils to their plates, sparks flying with each adjustment. Yet even as their own projects faltered, their mockery of Sarah continued, perhaps louder to disguise their unease. Sarah worked until her palms blistered. The rope was heavy with dust, her arms ached from pulling tension, and sweat clung to her temples. Still, she did not stop. The laughter dulled into background noise, then into silence within her mind. Each knot became a statement, each anchor a rebuttal more eloquent than words. She had no need to argue because the bridge would speak for her. When night fell, the temperature plunged. Alien shelters lit up with faint glows of energy and crystal, casting eerie reflections across the cliff. Sarah sat beside her rope in the cold darkness, her body shivering but her spirit anchored as firmly as her knots. The mockery had not broken her. It had sharpened her focus. She closed her eyes briefly and allowed herself a single thought before sleep. Tomorrow the rift would show which path was truth and which was pride dressed as progress. The first light of morning struck the rift with a merciless glare, and the alien projects came alive in motion. The Velkari twins worked with renewed intensity, their crystalline lattice shimmering like a frozen rainbow that stretched across a quarter of the chasm. Each extension sang a sharp note, a chorus of brittle music that echoed back against the cliffs. The Kethmoran warriors roared commands as coils of magnetized plates slid outward, locking into each other with sparks that burned the air. The Zalari pulsed with bright determination as energy rails extended over the void, a flickering ribbon of pure force. The plateau had become a contest of wills, every group pushing their structures farther into the rift as if to outpace the sun itself. Sarah rose from the cold ground with stiff limbs, her hands raw from knots tied through the night. She said nothing as she tightened the ropes she had prepared and tested the anchors with her weight. Around her, the mood was sharpened by competition. Each cadet wanted to be first to claim victory, and the laughter of the previous evening had transformed into grunts of labor and shouts of urgency. The rift did not care who won, but the cadets acted as though the abyss itself demanded recognition. The first disaster came without warning. A Velkari crystal strand snapped under a sudden gust, shattering into shards that scattered like knives of glass. One of the twins stumbled back, his faceted face lit with shock as fragments sliced across the cliff. His sister steadied him with a sharp movement, her crystalline limbs scraping harshly against the rock. Together they attempted to reinforce the broken section, but another crack rang out as a second strand gave way. The lattice trembled like a harp under too much tension. The structure sagged dangerously, pulling against its anchors. The siblings spoke quickly in their chiming tongue, adjusting angles and thickening the filaments. But the rift had already decided their fate. With a shriek of breaking crystal, the lattice fractured down its length and collapsed into the abyss, glittering shards spiraling downward until the winds swallowed them whole. Gasps spread across the plateau. Even the Kethmoran warriors paused in their labor to watch the spectacle. The Velkari twins stood rigid, their bodies refracting sorrow into sharp glints of color. Pride had cracked along with their bridge. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy despite the ridicule she had endured, but she did not move toward them. She tightened another knot, silent as ever. The Kethmoran team pressed forward with redoubled fury. 4 arms worked in synchronized power as one warrior adjusted the magnetic frequency while another hammered plates into place. Sparks spat from the joints, sizzling into the dust. Their structure extended nearly halfway across the rift, glowing faintly as energy surged between the plates. To an untrained eye, it looked formidable, but Sarah noticed the way the edges wavered under the shifting wind. The panels were rigid, unyielding, and every gust twisted them against each other. The warriors shouted louder as if strength of voice could hold the structure firm. A gust stronger than the rest roared from the depths, bending the panels upward. The coils strained, sparks bursting violently. One warrior cursed in his native tongue and threw his weight onto a support, but the strain snapped the locking mechanism. A chain of failures rippled across the plates as one joint after another gave way. The bridge shuddered, twisted, and tore apart in a thunder of metallic screeches. Panels tumbled end over end into the rift, sparks trailing like fireflies before darkness consumed them. The warriors' roars turned into guttural cries of frustration, fists pounding against the stone in helpless rage. The Zalari cadets pressed their glowing hands together, pouring more energy into their flickering rail. For a time, the ribbon of force held, a path of shimmering light across the void. Yet as the sun climbed higher, the winds shifted unpredictably, bending the energy into ripples. The Zalari pushed harder, bodies pulsing with unstable brightness. The rail wavered dangerously and then snapped with a violent discharge, scattering fragments of pure force into the air. One cadet stumbled back, his translucent body dimming as exhaustion overcame him. Another dropped to one knee, trembling as the last glow faded from her veins. Their project dissolved into nothing, leaving only silence where light had been. The hegemon drones fared no better. They had projected a walkway of shifting patterns, but the wind struck them with merciless force. One drone was torn from formation, then another, the line unraveling in moments. The serpentine cadet who commanded them let out a hiss of defeat as his drone spun into the abyss. One by one, every proud construction succumbed to the rift. What had seemed unshakable under design crumbled under the reality of the abyss. The air filled with the echoes of collapse, shattering crystal, screeching metal, crackling energy, and then the silence that followed was louder than the noise itself. The cadets stood scattered across the plateau, stunned, their confidence shredded like their bridges. Sarah alone remained steady. She did not gloat, did not smile. She knelt beside her rope, running her hand along the fibers to test for wear, and adjusted her knots. Her bridge had not yet begun, but already the rift had shown her what it rejected. Rigid pride could not stand where the winds ruled. Only something that bent could survive. Murmurs began among the cadets. Some spoke bitterly of unfair currents. Others blamed the timing of the test or the quality of their materials. The Velkari twins stood apart, silent, their faces unreadable prisms of fractured light. The Kethmaran warriors roared again, pounding their fists in fury, but their voices carried no triumph. The Zalari remained dim, drained from their effort, their glow reduced to a faint pulse. The instructor's voice returned, colder than before. Half the cycle has passed. The rift remains uncrossed. The words hung over the plateau like a sentence. For many cadets, the test was already lost. Sarah tied another knot. The collapse of brilliance around her had not shaken her. It had sharpened her purpose. She knew the eyes of every cadet were upon her now, some filled with scorn still, others with reluctant curiosity. But she did not lift her head. She pressed the rope against the stone, braced it with her weight, and whispered words no one else could hear. Bend. Never break. The rift had claimed every boast, every structure that had dared to defy it. Soon it would learn that not all who crossed it sought to fight. Some would listen. Some would weave. Some would survive. Sarah rose to her feet as the silence thickened around the plateau. Every cadet had seen the rift claim the proud designs, and none had a clear plan left. The wind blew dust into her face, but she stood unmoved, rope draped over her shoulder like a banner of stubborn resolve. Her hands were blistered and raw, yet steady, guided by a memory older than the academy and stronger than ridicule. She carried the rope to the cliff's edge and planted her feet. No words announced what she was about to do. She simply began. She looped the rope around the anchor stone she had tested the day before and braced it with a series of tight knots, each cinched with her full weight. The fibers groaned as they settled into the groove, and she leaned back with her entire body, testing for give. The line held firm. She wrapped the free length around her waist and began the slow, careful process of feeding it across the void. The cadets gathered at a distance, murmurs rising, but none dared approach. Some whispered disbelief, others muttered derision, yet more than one watched with grudging silence. The first step into the rift was not a step at all, but a crawl. Sarah lowered herself over the edge, body pressed against the stone as she inched along the cliff face. The rope slid across her palms, burning her skin, but she ignored the pain. Every inch forward was a fight against instinct, a demand to keep moving even as the abyss yawned below, promising nothing but darkness. Her breath grew shallow, her heartbeat loud in her ears, but her focus remained absolute. She reached a narrow outcrop and drove an iron pin into the stone, tying another knot and feeding the rope onward. With each anchor, her bridge grew. The wind tested her with sudden gusts, forcing her body against the cliff and making the rope sway like a living serpent. She moved with the motion, bending instead of resisting, letting the current carry her until it passed. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her of the lesson she had once doubted. A bridge that stiffens will snap. A rope that sways will endure. She climbed higher, secured another anchor, and stretched the line farther across the rift. Slowly, a path of tension and balance began to take shape. The sun climbed, glaring against the dust, but she worked without pause. Her arms trembled with fatigue, her lips cracked from the dry air, yet every knot pulled tighter, every anchor embedded deeper. By midday, the rope spanned more than half the chasm, swaying in rhythm with the wind, but never loosening. The cadets had stopped mocking by then. They watched with narrowed eyes, some in disbelief, others in silence that bordered on respect. The Valkyrie twins stood together, their crystalline bodies reflecting shards of light as they studied her progress with unreadable expressions. One of the Kethmoran warriors folded his forearms, no longer roaring insults, but watching as though trying to memorize each knot. When she reached the far side of the rift, she drove the final anchor into place and tied it with shaking hands. The rope bridge stretched across the abyss, simple yet unbroken, a swaying path of fibers that had defied the rift where brilliance had failed. She leaned against the stone wall, panting, sweat dripping into her eyes. The task was not complete until she crossed it, and she knew the eyes of every cadet demanded proof. She stepped onto the rope with bare feet, gripping the line with her hands for balance. The bridge swayed under her weight, but she bent her knees and adjusted to the rhythm, moving not against the motion, but with it. The wind pressed against her body, tugging her sideways, but she leaned into the force and kept walking. Step after step carried her into the void, suspended between two cliffs with nothing beneath her but a mile of darkness. Halfway across, the wind rose with sudden violence. Dust and grit whipped into her face, and the rope lurched wildly. A chorus of gasps erupted from the cliff behind her, but she dropped to a crouch, hugging the rope with her arms and legs, riding the sway like a branch in a storm. The gust howled, then passed, leaving her swaying but unbroken. She lifted herself again and continued forward, each movement deliberate, each breath measured. The opposite cliff drew closer, her anchor stone gleaming with promise. When her feet touched solid rock again, she exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. She turned to face the others, her body drenched in sweat, her hands bleeding from raw rope burns. The bridge stretched behind her, a swaying line of survival across the rift. She had crossed, alone, with nothing but rope, knots, and resolve. No cheers greeted her, no applause thundered across the plateau. The silence was heavier than sound. The cadets stood still, caught between disbelief and recognition. The Valkyrie twins lowered their heads, crystalline surfaces dimming under the sun. The Kethmoran warriors shifted uneasily, their arms folding tight across their chests. The Zalari pulsed faintly, their dim light rising and falling in waves of quiet awe. Sarah did not speak. She simply raised a hand and touched the rope, showing that the path remained open. The bridge was not hers alone now. It belonged to anyone brave enough to step upon it. The rift had been crossed, not through power or brilliance, but through patience and endurance. The cadets could follow or not. It made no difference to her. She had done what the rift demanded. She sat on the rock, cradling her blistered hands, while the wind hummed through the rope like a song. The human bridge swayed with the rhythm of the abyss, alive, enduring, unbroken. The rope bridge swayed between the cliffs like a heartbeat stretched across the void. Sarah remained seated on the far side, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths as the wind played through the fibers. She did not move to call the others forward, did not beckon with words or gestures. She had already proven what she came to prove. The bridge stood, and her crossing was complete. It was up to the others to decide whether they would trust it. For a long time, no one moved. The cadets remained on the plateau, some staring into the abyss as if the emptiness might swallow their pride, others watching the human who had crossed, while their own creations lay shattered at the rift's bottom. The silence stretched, until at last, one figure stepped forward. The Zalari cadet who had watched her with quiet curiosity from the beginning moved closer to the rope. His translucent body pulsed with a steady glow as he bent to examine the fibers. He touched the line with delicate hands, feeling the tension that hummed through it. His light flickered once, and then he placed a foot upon the rope. Gasps followed his action, but he ignored them. He gripped the line with both hands and began to move forward, his body glowing brighter as determination filled him. The bridge swayed under his weight, but the knots held, the anchors remained firm, and he crossed step by step. Sarah rose to her feet and extended a hand when he neared the far side. He accepted it without hesitation, his translucent face glowing with gratitude. No words passed between them, but his expression was clear. Respect had been earned not through argument, but through endurance. His action broke the stillness. Another cadet approached. The Velkari brother, his crystalline body dulled by failure yet sharpened by resolve. He had mocked her the loudest, yet now he stepped onto the rope with careful movements, his limbs refracting shards of light across the abyss. The bridge flexed under his rigid frame, but he adjusted with stiff grace, his eyes fixed on the human who stood waiting. When he reached the far side, he paused before her. For a moment his pride held him silent, then his crystalline head bowed a fraction. It was not a grand gesture, but from a Velkari, it was an acknowledgement deeper than speech. One by one, more cadets followed. The Kethmoran warriors approached with hesitation, masked by scowls. The largest of them gripped the rope with all four arms and snarled as the wind shoved against his body, but he continued with teeth bared until he reached solid ground. He met Sarah's gaze with eyes burning in frustration, yet his hand struck his chest in a salute that carried the weight of his people's warrior tradition. Another warrior followed, then another, until the line of cadets grew across the rope like beads upon a string. Each arrival was marked not by celebration, but by silence, the silence of understanding that pride had been humbled by persistence. When the last cadet crossed, the instructor's hover platform descended with a low hum. The figure who emerged was tall and cloaked, his voice resonating with authority. The directive was simple. Cross the rift within the cycle. All of you attempted it. Only one completed it first. His gaze turned toward Sarah, and for the first time his tone softened. "Human, step forward." She obeyed, standing before him with blistered hands at her sides. Her uniform was streaked with dust, her hair tangled, her body exhausted, yet she stood straight, her chin lifted. The instructor regarded her in silence before speaking again. "You brought no brilliance of machines, no splendor of crystal, no rail of force. You brought rope, and yet you achieved what none else accomplished. What lesson do you believe this proves?" Her throat was dry, but her voice held steady. That the rift did not ask for power. It asked for something that could bend without breaking. The instructor studied her for a long moment. Then he raised his voice so every cadet could hear. "Let this be remembered. Technology may dazzle, strength may impress, but the rift respects only resilience. This cadet has shown that endurance and patience can bridge what arrogance cannot. Learn this, or you will fail greater trials than this one." A hush swept across the group. The Velkari sister lowered her head in shame. The Kethmoran warriors stood in silence with arms folded across their broad chests, and the Zalari pulsed with gentle light as if echoing the truth of the words. The lesson was not for Sarah alone, but for all who had witnessed the collapse of pride and the rise of perseverance. When the instructor dismissed them, the cadets dispersed slowly, no longer boasting or mocking. Some approached Sarah with tentative gestures, a nod here, a glance there, not yet words of friendship, but acknowledgments of respect. The Velkari brother lingered longest, his crystalline form reflecting the rope bridge still swaying between the cliffs. At last he spoke in a tone stripped of scorn. "Your knots were stronger than our pride. I will remember this." Then he turned and walked away. Sarah remained at the edge of the rift for a while, watching the rope dance with the wind. The fibers hummed softly, alive with the rhythm of the abyss, a reminder that survival was not always about domination, but about harmony. She touched the rope with her bleeding fingers and smiled faintly. What had begun as humiliation had become triumph, not because she had silenced the laughter, but because she had outlasted it. When the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the plateau, she coiled the rope once more and slung it across her shoulder. The bridge would remain behind for others to use, but the lesson was hers to carry. She walked away from the rift with her body aching and her spirit steady, knowing that the academy had changed in a single cycle. The cadets would remember the collapse of brilliance, but they would never forget the human who had crossed with nothing more than rope, knots, and quiet resolve. For Sarah, the conclusion was clear. Survival was not about defiance, nor about spectacle. It was about listening, adapting, and enduring. She had crossed the rift, but more than that, she had crossed the line between ridicule and respect. The academy would never mock her tools again. The human bridge had stood, and it had carried them all.